Great. I think we're ready to get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Rebecca Bryant, and I'm the Director of Community for ORCID. And I'm glad that you're all here today to join us for our panel where we're going to be talking about ORCID and how the publishing community is adopting ORCID. So the format for our panel today is that we have 5 speakers, including myself. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes providing just a bit of an overview about ORCID, about where ORCID is working with different parts of the community, and sort of set us up to talk more in depth about how the publishing community is using ORCID. And that's where we have our 4 panelists who will each take about 15 minutes to talk about their specific integration of ORCID and how they're using ORCID and what their plans are for the future. So I will start by asking you how many of you have an ORCID ID? How many of you have heard of ORCID? Okay. And how many of you are using ORCID within your organizations? Okay. Great. So yes, all the hands go up here. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about ORCID and telling you a little bit more about it. So the first thing is sort of understanding the problem and why do we need a persistent identifier? And that's because people's names change, because they're really common, because they may be transliterated in different ways, and all of you probably know either from your firsthand personal experience or from your work within the industry that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, is this the right Wei Wong? Is this the right Jay Smith? Who is this person, and how can we ensure that they get credit for their work every time? So that's where ORCID comes in. And I tend to talk about ORCID in 2 ways. So the first is what ORCID is as an organization. We are a nonprofit, non-proprietary, community-driven, and open organization that works across all disciplines and across all national boundaries. In a nutshell, it's actually, we're trying to lead what's a pretty ambitious project, and that is to provide the ORCID ID to all researchers and scholars around the world. So each individual researcher will have their own distinctive ORCID ID, like the one you see at the bottom of the right column. That's my ORCID ID. That distinctively identifies me from all other Rebecca Bryants, all other R. Bryants, all other Rebecca B's from around the world. The value of that ORCID ID is that it's a standard. It can be used across systems. It stays with you throughout your career, and it distinguishes you from all other people. And in addition, the ORCID ID can be embedded within the workflows within your community, within publishing, within grant applications, and other places, and we can use that to exchange information more readily so we don't keep entering the same information over and over and over. We are supported by member organizations that pay an annual fee to use the ORCID API, and that is how we are supported as a nonprofit organization. So again, a lot of what we're trying to achieve is this disambiguation of people, but it's also to improve, enable the interoperability of information between systems, grant applications, repositories, university researcher information systems or repositories, the publishing communities, and so on. So a little bit about where ORCID is. ORCID launched its registry in October of 2012, so we're about 18-20 months old as a product at this point. During that period of time, we now have about 720,000 people who have claimed their ORCID identifier. And what you can see from the pie chart on the upper right is that also we have broad adoption from all parts of the scholarly communications community. About 25% of our member organizations are publishers. A large percentage, about 40% now, are actually medical schools, universities, research centers, and then we also have representation from repository and profile systems, professional associations, and the funding community across the United States, Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world. We also are seeing adoption, and this is from the bar chart in the lower left. The light blue is the adoption, a number of people who are coming to claim their ORCID ID because they're being referred by another site. That is somebody who's coming through one of these publications, workflows, and is learning about ORCID, is being requested. Maybe they're seeing it through a funding workflow. The dark blue are a number of people who are just coming to independently access our site. So for those of you who don't have an ORCID ID yet, I encourage you, you can go to orcid.org. It'll take you about 30 seconds. You can be part of this blue part on my chart next month. The orange is the number of people who are getting ORCID IDs because they're being created by their employer or institution. And that large bump we saw in March actually is Texas A&M creating ORCID IDs for its 10,000 graduate students. So we're beginning to see more of that. So I want to very quickly walk you through and try to show you sort of the ecosystem of how we're seeing adoption, and then we're going to go more in depth about what's happening with the publishing community. We're seeing strong support from the funding community. So you can see on the upper left a statement from the U.S. National Institutes of Health encouraging the adoption of unique IDs for researchers. That is ORCID. So they've actually incorporated into their Science CD platform. That's an interagency platform that later this year will also begin being used by the National Science Foundation. We've also seen adoption from the Department of Energy in the United States within their grant submission, and also strong support and encouragement of ORCID identifiers from the European Commission. Some of the organizations, funders that are using ORCID IDs are listed here. The ones that are in green are the ones that are requiring ORCID IDs. One in the United States is Autism Speaks. We've seen FCT in Portugal, which I believe Michael may talk a little bit more about. Yeah, and also we don't have an integration yet, but the Swedish Research Foundation has made the same commitment. They were planning to actually require that all of their researchers use this. So you can see broad international adoption here. A little bit about universities incorporating into a number of different systems. We actually had our outreach meeting last week in Chicago, and we got to see a lot of the things that universities are doing: electronic theses and dissertations, repositories, research information, CRIS systems, and so forth, creating records. A long list of universities. You can see the ones, this isn't all of them for sure, in the United States, a lot of these sort of member, leader organizations, but also worldwide, very prestigious list of research-oriented institutions that are adopting ORCID IDs. One example is that Texas A&M creating ORCID IDs for its 10,000 graduate students, and then moving on also to be creating for faculty, and we're seeing other institutions that have been doing that. They are really promoting ORCID ID as something that is an essential part of your scholarly identity. It is something you are developing, you should know about, you shouldn't be leaving Texas A&M with a PhD or a master's degree and not understand what it is, not have one, and not know how to use it. So now we're getting to the publishing community. Publishers are requesting ORCID IDs at the point of manuscript submission. The goal being that that data is part of the metadata, just like your name. It flows through to that system, and it can be displayed, and it's become something that we can use to better discover information and better know who it's attached to. Long list also of organizations from the publishing community and also from professional associations, which I know many of you are from. And Brooks can also talk a bit more about that perspective from professional associations. A couple notes that we're really encouraging for collection and display of ORCID identifiers within the publishing community. We really encourage the integration. We very much want you to use the API to collect it. It is a 16-digit number, like a credit card, and it's really very important that we use machine to machine. We take advantage of APIs in order to exchange this information and make sure that it's the information we think it is. We encourage you to encourage all authors to obtain an ORCID ID. Make sure that you're seeing that all the way through your publications workflow, that's going on, that data is going to Crossref, and then that information can be pulled back into the ORCID record. And that's also functionality that we're planning to release later this year, so that information can be messaged back to the researcher. Hey, we see you have this publication. Let's add this to your record. And those things can become automated, and that's where we start to see some realization of this of the ORCID project beginning to really make life easier for researchers and help us to make maintenance of this information much, much easier. We're going to also have Cesar and Brooks talk a little bit more about recognizing reviewer service. I've seen a lot of discussion about this. We have a working group talking about this. They'll talk a bit about more about that. Our slides will be available online. We'll be releasing those later, and I'll tweet about it when those are available. A lot more information on our website. We want to make sure that you access that. And there's also a lot of information about how you can become an ORCID member organization. Our speakers here are going to talk about how this will allow you to use the API to read ORCID information, to send data such as publications to an ORCID record, to integrate a search and link wizard that can enable researchers to link with their works and also disambiguate past works, and also link an identifier that you may have within your system to ORCID. And also within the university or community to actually even create ORCID records on behalf of your employees. Lots more researchers. We strongly encourage you to follow our blog, follow us on Twitter, and learn more. So at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Habib from Elsevier, who's going to talk about what they've been doing with ORCID.